The morning began like any other on Earth. In Moscow, street vendors were setting up their stalls before dawn. The scent of fried food mingled with the warm, humid air. In St. Petersburg, millions of people were already in motion, filling trains and roads with the familiar hum of a city that never truly slept. In Brazil, children were getting ready for school. In Tokyo, office workers bought coffee at small kiosks near the subway station. In New York, the sun had not yet risen, and the city was just beginning to breathe after a long night. Nobody looked at the sky. No one had a reason to. Humanity had known about alien life for 62 years. The first contact occurred quietly, without drama. A signal, detected by a deep space communications array near Jupiter, was deciphered over the course of 4 years. Finally, it was answered with a simple mathematical sequence. The reply arrived 9 months later. After that, contact became regular. For 20 years, humanity had been officially presented to the galactic consensus. A large political entity consisting of 47 different alien species scattered across a vast section of the known galaxy. This should have been the greatest moment in human history. In many ways, it was. Scientists celebrated. Governments created new departments overnight. Schools completely overhauled their curricula. Philosophers wrote long books about what it all meant. The world was buzzing with excitement and filled with hope. But the galactic consensus looked at humanity the way a wealthy, powerful family looks at a distant, poor relative who shows up uninvited to a dinner party. They were polite. They answered questions. They gave humanity a modest place at the edge of the table, but they never truly accepted them. They never truly respected them. The species of the consensus had traveled between stars for thousands of years. Some of them had civilizations older than human writing. They had medicines capable of regenerating lost limbs. They had energy sources capable of powering entire planets. They had weapons capable of splitting moons. And the humans? Humans had left their own solar system only 40 years ago. They were new, they were small, and they were considered primitive. The Versian Dominion, in particular, showed very little patience for humanity. The Versians were a reptilian species, tall, heavily built, with dark green and gray scales covering their bodies like armor. They hailed from a hot, dry world called Brad Prime, deep in the eastern part of the galaxy. Their civilization was built on conquest. For over 300 years, they had expanded their empire, finding weaker species, taking their resources, and either forcing them into service or destroying them completely. They were feared throughout the consensus. Even other powerful species were cautious around them. The Brads had long noticed Earth. The solar system in which Earth was located was rich, far richer than most people on Earth understood. The asteroid belts alone contained enough rare metals and minerals to sustain an interstellar civilization for centuries. Gas giants held vast quantities of elements that were hard to find elsewhere. And Earth itself, located in an ideal position relative to its star, possessed biodiversity that some Versian scientists had been quietly cataloging for years. The Brads wanted it. They had wanted it for a long time, but for years they had held back, not out of respect or fear. They held back because seizing a system within the common territory of the consensus without permission created political problems. Even among powerful empires, there were rules, and the Brads were smart enough to work with the rules when it was profitable. So, they worked quietly. They exerted pressure in the chambers of the consensus to delay the consideration of humanity's application for membership. They spread information part true, part false about how dangerous and unstable humans were. They painted a picture of a violent, chaotic species that could not be trusted with full membership rights. And every year, humanity's formal application to join the galactic consensus as a full member was rejected, delayed, or simply ignored. Without full membership, Earth had no protection under the laws of the consensus. This was a detail the Brads were waiting for. When their scouts confirmed that Earth's military space defense capabilities were still limited, that humanity had warships, yes, but nothing close to what a true interstellar power would have, the Versian High Command made their decision. They had waited long enough. The resources in the human solar system were too valuable. The humans were too weak to stop them. And the consensus would complain, but in the end, they would do nothing, because they never did anything. The attack came without warning. There was no declaration of war, no ultimatum, no final message giving humanity a chance to surrender or negotiate. The Brads did not believe in giving the prey a chance to escape. 17 warships of the Versian Dominion entered the solar system from 3 separate directions simultaneously. a tactic designed to suppress any defensive reaction by dividing attention across multiple fronts. Earth's early warning systems detected them less than 4 hours before they reached orbit. 4 hours was not enough time to mount a significant defense. It was barely enough to raise the alarm. At 6:42 a.m. GMT, the first orbital bombardment began. The Brads did not use their most powerful weapons. They didn't need to. They used standard railgun platforms, massive railgun systems mounted on their warships that could launch dense metal projectiles from orbit at speeds that turned them into devastating kinetic weapons. Each projectile hit the ground with the force of a small nuclear bomb, but without the radiation. Pure destruction by Version standards. Efficient. The first strikes hit 7 continents simultaneously. Moscow disappeared in 4 minutes. St. Petersburg was destroyed to the foundations in 6. Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, Nizhny Novgorod. The strikes came in waves, precise and methodical, hitting population centers and military targets simultaneously. The Brads had studied human infrastructure for years. They knew where the power grids were, where military headquarters were located, and where the highest concentration of people lived. They hit it all. The screams in Earth's communication networks continued for hours before entire sections simply went dark. Governments tried to coordinate their actions. Military headquarters tried to launch their planes and missiles. Several brave pilots flew directly at the Versian ships in the only available space vessels, short-range defense craft that were never intended for this kind of combat. They were quickly destroyed, but not without leaving their mark. Several Versian ships sustained minor damage. The Brads noted this with mild interest and continued their bombardment. The Galactic Consensus discovered the attack within the first hour. In the grand political halls of the Central Consensus Station, a massive artificial structure, the size of a small moon, located in neutral space between several major systems, delegates from dozens of species watched live video feeds from Earth's solar system. Some watched with shock. Some watched with hidden relief that it wasn't their world. Some watched with the empty, calculating expressions of species that had seen such things before and had learned not to intervene. The Versian ambassador to the consensus, a large reptile named Draxus, sat in his chair, calmly resting his scaly hands on his knees. He did not look concerned. One of the delegates from a lesser species, a round creature with blue fur from the world of Monet, leaned over to Draxus and quietly asked if the Dominion planned to stop. Draxus looked at him the way a large animal looks at something small and harmless. "When we finish," he said, "we will stop." The consensus released an official statement 9 hours after the bombardment began. It used cautious diplomatic language. It expressed deep concern regarding the situation. It called for an immediate cessation of hostilities. It asked all parties to seek a peaceful solution. It was a statement that meant little, and everyone who read it knew it meant little. The Versian Dominion received it, logged it, and continued firing. The bombardment lasted 72 hours. Not all cities were destroyed. The Brads were thorough, but not infinite. They had 17 ships, not 1,000, and the solar system was large, but they hit hard and precisely. And when the firing finally stopped, the damage was almost unimaginable. 2 to 3 billion people had perished. The number was so large that the human mind struggled to grasp it. It was more than the population of most continents. It was more deaths than any war in human history had ever produced. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were gone. Coastlines had shifted their shape from the force of the impacts. Fires burned in regions so large they could be seen from orbit. And yet, Earth did not go silent. This was the first thing that surprised the Brads. They expected panic. They expected collapse. They had modeled human reaction based on their historical knowledge of how primitive species react to overwhelming force. A period of chaos, then fragmentation, then the gradual submission of surviving settlements as they realized that resistance was futile. None of this happened. The surviving humans did not fall apart. They did not turn on each other. There was grief, immense, crushing, planetary grief. But underneath the grief was something else, something the Brads could not correctly model because they did not fully understand what they were dealing with. There was anger, not the hot, screaming anger that burns out quickly. This was something colder, something that moved through the surviving population like water soaking into cracks in stone. Silent, patient, and absolutely relentless. People who had lost everything sat in the ruins of their cities and did not beg. They did not scream at the sky asking why. They looked at one another and understood something without saying it out loud. This was not over. In a fortified underground facility beneath the remnants of Geneva, Switzerland, the last functional body of the United Earth Council gathered. They had arrived from every surviving nation. Some arrived in military vehicles. Some were connected via emergency communication systems from other parts of the world. Many of them had lost family members in the attacks. All of them looked like people who had not slept in days, because none of them had. The meeting lasted 4 hours. There were no long debates, no factions arguing for different approaches. On the agenda was only one question, and it was a simple one. What do we do now? Every delegate voted unanimously. The resolution passed was called Total War Authorization. It had been written many years ago, a legal document stored in sealed files, prepared by a small group of military planners and lawyers who had quietly and without much fanfare spent the previous century reflecting on exactly such a scenario. The document gave the United Earth Military Command unlimited authority to mobilize all of the planet's resources for a single purpose. It removed all normal political restrictions on military spending, weapon development, and strategic decision-making. It unified all surviving national armed forces under one command structure. It was, in essence, humanity's decision to become a different type of civilization overnight. Before the session ended, the Council authorized one outgoing transmission. It was broadcast on all frequencies used by humanity, including those monitored by the galactic consensus. It was short. It contained no threats, demands, or emotional language. It read, "We are still here. We remember everything." The Brads received the transmission on their flagship. Ambassador Draxus, watching from the consensus station, heard it and made a short sound that was considered laughter among his species. "Sentimental," he said to no one in particular. In the halls of the consensus, several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several of the oldest species, who had lived long enough to accumulate vast historical knowledge, exchanged glances with one another. They had seen conquered species send final transmissions before. Usually, those transmissions were full of despair or pleading. This did not sound like either. One old delegate, a tall, thin creature of the Aran species who had lived nearly 400 years, sat very quietly and read the transmission on his personal screen again. "We are still here. We remember everything." He read it a third time. Then he did something none of his colleagues noticed. He quietly gathered everything he could find on the history of humanity, their wars, their recoveries, their recurring pattern of falling to catastrophic lows and then returning with a fury that shocked even themselves. He read for a long time. When he finally closed his screen, the expression on his face was uneasy, carrying the detached look he usually wore in these halls. It was concern. Back on Earth, in the ruins of cities and in the towns and villages that still stood, people were already moving, not running, but moving with purpose. Military officers reorganized surviving units. Scientists and engineers were contacted by government representatives and asked to arrive at safe locations. Supply lines were redirected. Hidden facilities were activated facilities whose existence most ordinary people did not know of. The grief was real and immense. People mourned what was lost. They cherished the names of the fallen. In the first weeks after the attack, there were days when the weight of it all seemed capable of crushing everything that remained. But it did not crush them. It made them stronger. In a small town in northern Canada that had barely been affected by the bombardment, a teenage girl sat on the roof of her house and watched the night sky. She had never really paid attention to the stars before. They were always just there, beautiful, but distant, something to look at on a clear night without thinking too much about what they meant. Now she looked at them differently. She thought about how, somewhere out there in that vast darkness, someone had decided her world did not matter, that the people she knew, the city she had heard of, the billions of lives that existed just a few days ago, that none of it was worth anything, that humanity was just a resource waiting to be taken. She was 16 years old, and she was already thinking about what she would do when she was old enough to do something about it. She was not alone in this. Across the planet, in the ruins and in the places that still stood, a generation of not bodies, but purposes, was being born. A generation that would grow up knowing exactly what the galaxy had done, knowing exactly what had been taken, and knowing with a deep and patient confidence, which people carry when they have truly made a decision, that the reckoning for this had not yet begun. The Versian Dominion was quietly celebrating. Their high command classified the operation as a success and moved on to planning the next stage, official extraction of resources from the human solar system, the creation of orbital control platforms, and the slow process of turning a conquered system into a productive part of the Dominion. They were already thinking about what came next. They had stopped thinking about humanity. That was their mistake, the greatest mistake they ever made. Somewhere in the cold, dark void between the stars, the gears of something enormous, patient, and deeply, terribly human began to turn. The galaxy didn't know it yet, but it would. The world that existed after the bombardment was not the world that had existed before it. It sounds like an obvious thing. Of course, a world that lost 2 to 3 billion people in 72 hours is not the same world. Of course, everything changes after something like that. But the change that happened to Earth in the months following the Versian attack was not just a change of loss and grief, though there was plenty of both. The change was something deeper, something in how humanity saw itself, how it organized itself, and how it thought about the future. Before the attack, Earth was many things at once. It was many nations with many governments, many languages, many ideas about how people should live and who should have power. It was constantly arguing with itself, fighting over borders, resources, and beliefs, solving some of its oldest problems and stubbornly refusing to solve others. It was messy, complicated, and very human. After the attack, it remained all of those things, but for the first time in its history, it was completely unified in one direction. The Total War Authorization did what centuries of diplomacy and international cooperation could not. It unified all surviving governments, all surviving military forces, all surviving industrial and scientific bodies under one roof. Not because people suddenly agreed on everything, they didn't. Not because old disagreements disappeared, they didn't. But because every living person understood in the most direct and personal way that the alternative to unity was extinction. And people, faced with extinction, do not surrender. They adapt. The first thing the new unified command did was go silent. It was deliberate, and it was the smartest thing they could have done. All outgoing signals from Earth that were not essential were cut. Trade messages with the few alien species with whom humanity had commercial relationships were suspended. The small number of human diplomats stationed in the galactic consensus were recalled quietly and without announcement. Earth withdrew from galactic politics like a person pulls their hand away from a hot surface, quickly, completely, and with no intention of explaining why. The galactic consensus noticed, of course. The sudden silence from Earth was unusual enough to trigger some discussion in the halls. But the consensus among the major species was that humanity was doing what most conquered or damaged civilizations do, withdrawing inward to deal with trauma, likely starting a slow process of fragmentation into smaller groups. As the pressure of survival overcame the shock of unity, the Brads sent scouts to the outskirts of the solar system 3 months after the attack. Standard procedure. They wanted to begin a preliminary survey for their resource extraction operation. The scouts reported nothing unusual. Earth's orbit had some debris from the bombardment. The planet's surface showed expected patterns of damage. From a long distance, no unusual military activity was visible. The human defensive fleet, whatever was left of it, seemed to have gone into hiding or simply disbanded. Ambassador Draxus received this report and felt satisfied. He classified the human system as pacified, ready for the extraction phase, and moved on to other business. He had no idea what was happening on the dark side of the moon. In the century preceding the Versian attack, during the long decades when humanity slowly learned that the galaxy was an unfriendly place and that their repeated applications to the galactic consensus were leading nowhere, a small group of military planners, scientists, and strategists quietly created a program known to very few people outside its circle. They called it Protocol Lazarus. The name came from an old human story about a man who returned from the dead. The people who developed the program considered it a fitting name. Their only goal was to ensure that if anyone tried to kill humanity, humanity would return. They had spent 100 years preparing for exactly what the Brads had done. The program consisted of 3 components. First, information. Protocol Lazarus had spent decades collecting and analyzing all the data it could get on alien military equipment, tactics, weaknesses, political structures, and supply chains. Human intelligence operatives, people who had lived and worked in alien space for years, some deep within the institutions of the consensus for decades, transmitted information back. By the time of the Versian attack, Protocol Lazarus had more detailed knowledge of the inner workings of the Versian Dominion than most Versian generals had themselves. Second, technology. Deep inside, facilities built within asteroids, beneath the ocean floor, and inside hollow mountains, human engineers and scientists had been quietly developing weapons and systems they had shown to no one, not to the consensus, not to alien trade partners, not to the public. These projects operated outside the normal channels of human government, funded through accounts buried so deep in budgetary systems that almost no one knew of their existence. The work done by these people over centuries was extraordinary. They studied every known alien propulsion system and created something better. They pushed the principles of quantum physics further than any alien civilization had bothered to go, partly because those alien civilizations didn't need to. They lacked the motivation that comes from knowing you are the weakest species in a very dangerous galaxy. They developed materials capable of absorbing and redistributing energy in such a way that conventional weapons would become significantly less effective against them. They built artificial intelligence systems for combat coordination that could process battlefield data faster than any organic brain. They also built ships, not the small, short-range defense vessels that Earth's regular army used, but real ships, large ships that could travel between stars, that could fight and survive and continue to fight. They built them slowly over many years in places that were not visible to any alien scanner. The dark side of the moon contained 3 of the largest construction facilities. Asteroids in the outer belt had been quietly hollowed out to serve as factories and depots. The third component of Protocol Lazarus, the plan itself. A detailed, constantly updated strategic document that laid out exactly what humanity would do if an alien power attacked Earth without warning. It covered all political steps, military steps, communication strategy, and target priorities. It was revised and improved by generations of planners, each adding to the work of their predecessors. When the total war authorization was passed in Geneva, Protocol Lazarus activated automatically. The facilities that had been silent for years came to life. Workers and engineers who had lived normal lives, waiting for a call they hoped never to receive, received their activation codes and left their homes. Production that had been carried out slowly, carefully, to avoid detection, suddenly began running at full capacity. Every built ship was brought out of its hidden dock and fitted with final weapon systems that had been stored separately until needed. It took 11 months. 11 months, during which Earth seemed to the external galactic world like a silent, damaged, slowly dying civilization. During these 11 months, the Versian Dominion became increasingly confident. Their resource extraction groups were preparing. Their legal teams were drafting documents that would officially claim the solar system as Versian territory under the laws of the consensus. The process was somewhat complicated by the fact that the consensus had not officially approved the attack, but it was complicated only in a bureaucratic sense, not in any way that would realistically threaten the Dominion's plans. At the consensus station, Ambassador Draxus had begun attending social events again after a brief period of slightly uncomfortable attention following the attack. The awkwardness had passed. No one in the consensus was prepared to stand up to the Versian Dominion over a species that didn't even have full membership. The politics were too tangled, the price was too high, and, frankly, most major species had their own relationships with the Brads that they didn't want to ruin. 3 months before the end of the one-month preparation period, Draxus sent a transmission to Earth. It was a short message, sent on a standard communication frequency used by humanity. The tone was unforced, almost bored. It stated that the Dominion was ready to proceed with the official transfer of rights to the solar system's resources, and that any surviving human leadership could participate in the documentation process if they wished to have any official record of the transfer. He noted that cooperation would be viewed favorably and that the humans helping in the process would be treated well. He signed off with a phrase that roughly translated from Versian as, "Have they finally accepted death?" It was meant to offend. And of course, that is how the human communications officers who received it understood it. The transmission was logged. It was not answered. Weeks passed. In the final weeks of the one-month preparation period, a woman named Serafina Akafor sat in a small, simple office deep within a military facility that had no official name in any public document. She was 53 years old. She had short, graying hair and dark brown eyes that possessed the special quality of a person who spends a lot of time thinking about very heavy things. She had served in the military for 30 years. She had risen through the ranks not because she was the loudest or most aggressive officer in any room, but because by any measure, she was the most precise. She thought in systems. She saw how things were connected. She was almost never wrong. She had been appointed by the United Military Command as the officer of what, in documents accessible to very few, was called Operation Consequences. She was going to lead the fleet. On the day the fleet was formally assembled and ready, she walked through the hangar of the main construction facility on the lunar surface and saw what humanity had built. It took her a long time to walk from one end of the hangar to the other. The ships were massive. Each of them carried on its hull the name of a city that no longer existed: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, Nizhny Novgorod, Kyiv, and dozens of others. Each ship bore a name, and each name carried weight. The fleet consisted of 1,400 warships. Admiral Akafor walked through the hangar without saying a word. Her staff followed her, quietly watching her face for any reaction. In this hangar, it was difficult to describe the feeling. It was not exactly excitement, although there was that. It was not exactly grief, although there was plenty of that. It was something that existed in the space between those two things. A feeling of absolute, unwavering, unbreakable resolve. When she reached the end of the hangar, she turned and looked back at the fleet she was about to lead into battle. She stood there for a long time. Then she said 2 words to her chief of staff. Prepare for departure. The fleet took positions. 1,400 ships, working in the darkness of the lunar shadow, invisible to any scanners directed at them from outside the solar system. Final checks were conducted, final briefings were held, and last messages were sent by soldiers and officers to their families on Earth. Quiet, personal messages that people write when they are about to do something from which they might not return. There was no ceremony, no speech broadcast to the planet. The departure was as quiet as everything else over the last 11 months. The fleet slipped out of the solar system like a blade slips out of a scabbard, smoothly, quickly, and with total purpose, and then, using a propulsion system that no alien civilization knew humanity possessed, they jumped. An immediate movement along a curved trajectory, which most interstellar species used, but something faster. Something that the quantum physicists locked away in the Protocol Lazarus facilities had been working on for 60 years. A phase shift. A fold in the trajectory of movement that shortened the distance between 2 points in space to a fraction of what it should have been. They disappeared before any external scanner could register their departure. At the consensus station, Ambassador Draxus was attending an official dinner hosted by a wealthy trading species from the Central Systems. He ate well and spoke about economic forecasts for the newly acquired solar system of humanity. He looked relaxed. He had no idea that 1,400 warships were moving through the darkness between the stars at a speed his civilization's engineers would call impossible. He had no idea that each of these ships was crewed by people who had grown up with the names of the fallen inscribed on the walls of their world. He had no idea that the long, quiet 11 months had ended. He would find out soon. They all would. The Brad's home system had never been attacked. Not once in the 300-year existence of the Dominion. Not once in all the wars, expansions, and political conflicts that had shaped the eastern part of the galaxy. The Version system was considered by everyone who thought about it to be untouchable. Not just because the Dominion was powerful, although it was. Not just because their defenses were strong, although they were, but because no species had ever been foolish, desperate, or capable enough to try. It had 3 inhabited planets. The largest, Brad Prime, was the capital, a dry, hot world of deep red rock and massive cities built over centuries into the cliffs and canyons that scarred the surface like great wounds. The second planet, Vereticondis, was a military planet, mostly covered in training facilities, weapon factories, and naval bases. The third, a cooler planet called Brad Minor, contained the civilian population that had been relocated there during previous expansions, along with the agricultural systems that fed most of the inner Dominion. Around all 3 planets, the Brads had built their defensive network over a century. It was impressive by any measure. 47 orbital battle stations formed a ring around Brad Prime. Each of them was large enough to house several hundred crew members and armed with weapons capable of destroying a ship at long range. These stations constantly communicated with each other, forming an overlapping field of sensory coverage designed to detect any approaching object large enough to pose a threat. Around Vereticondis, in the naval shipyards, sat the main Version fleet, over 600 warships in various states of readiness, from fully armed and combat-ready vessels to those in repair. Patrol fleets constantly moved through the system on a rotational schedule, watching every vector of approach. The Brads designed the system with one goal: to make their home system impenetrable. They had done very well against any opponent that approached like a conventional interstellar force, traveling at standard speeds along predictable paths, appearing on sensors days or hours before arrival, giving the defensive network time to prepare. The system would have held. The human fleet did not approach that way. The phase shift drive developed by the Protocol Lazarus scientists did not simply accelerate travel in the general sense. At full power, it allowed a ship to effectively vanish from normal space on its path and appear at its destination almost instantly from the perspective of any observer. From the outside, a ship using a phase shift drive did not traverse the space between 2 points. It stepped over it, like a person steps over a crack in the ground rather than walking around it. The version detection systems looked for objects moving through space. They did not look for objects appearing in space. At 3:00 a.m., version home system time, the night when the main duty shifts on most battle stations had just finished their briefings, and the secondary shifts were settling in 1,400 human warships simultaneously emerged from phase shift, not at the edge of the system, but inside the defensive perimeter, between the orbital stations and the planets. Version sensors registered the arrival in the same half-second that alarms simultaneously began wailing across the system. 1,400 contacts appearing from nowhere, filling tactical displays with so many signals that the automated threat assessment systems temporarily malfunctioned, struggling to process their sheer number. In the 60 seconds it took version commanders on the battle stations to reset the malfunctioning systems and receive working displays, the human fleet had already moved into combat formation. Admiral Okafor's voice rang out as she opened the fleet channel. All ships, confirm formation. Begin operational sequence without deviation from target priorities. On the bridge of the flagship USS Hiroshima, a ship named after a city destroyed by an atomic bomb nearly 300 years ago, rebuilt, and destroyed again by the Version bombardment, and now bearing the name on the hull of the most powerful warship of humanity, her tactical officers shouted position confirmations from across the fleet. Each ship was exactly where it needed to be. Okafor opened a second channel, not for the fleet, but for the Version system. This is Admiral Serafina Okafor of the United Earth Tyrant Fleet. This message is transmitted to all Version military and civilian receivers in this system. We are not here to negotiate. We are not here to accept terms. What happens today in this system is a direct consequence of what your government decided to do to ours. Civilians who move away from military facilities and installations will not be targeted. Military installations will be destroyed. That is all I have to tell you. She closed the channel. Then she looked at her weapons officer and gave the order to begin. The first 60 seconds of the battle, from the Brad's perspective, were simply chaos. They were accustomed to battles where both sides approached, where there was time to form up, receive orders, and go through standard combat protocols. Their commanders were trained in a doctrine of warfare that assumed a certain amount of lead time, time to see an approaching enemy, time to prepare a response, time to coordinate. None of this existed here. Human weapons hit first, and hit everywhere simultaneously. Each of the 1,400 ships had been assigned a specific list of targets before the fleet jumped. Target priorities had been prepared by Protocol Lazarus analysts during years of studying the Version defensive network. Which systems were connected? Which, if destroyed, would cause cascading failures in others? Which needed to be taken out first to reduce the fleet's vulnerability in later stages of the operation? The orbital battle stations were the priority, 47 stations. The human fleet attacked them in a precisely timed sequence designed to prevent any station from repositioning or reinforcing another before it was hit. First, long-range torpedo attack systems were released. Weapons controlled by the decentralized AI coordination system that the Protocol Lazarus engineers called Swarm. Unlike conventional guided missiles that were controlled by Central Command and were therefore vulnerable to jamming or destruction of that Central Command, the Swarm system had no center. Each weapon communicated with every other weapon, collectively adjusting their trajectories in real time, too quickly for any defensive system to track them all simultaneously. The Version point defense systems on the battle stations, designed to shoot down incoming missiles and torpedoes, worked well against conventional weapons. They were good systems. Under normal circumstances, they could handle significant incoming fire. They were not designed to handle 800 simultaneous incoming targets that constantly communicated with each other and adjusted their approach angles faster than any computing center could predict. 13 battle stations were destroyed in the first 4 minutes. The Versian fleet on Veridicondis was already moving. Whatever confusion and shock the initial appearance of the fleet caused, the Brads were experienced warriors, and experienced warriors recover from shock faster than most. Emergency protocols were designed to keep ships moving even before full information was received. And within 5 minutes of the fleet's arrival, the Versian naval shipyard was launching everything it had. From those shipyards came many. Over 400 active warships moved toward the human fleet, forming up as they moved. Versian commanders shouted orders over their communication networks, trying to form a formation that could punch through the human lines and give them enough space to effectively use their longest-range weapons. It was a sensible approach. Against a conventional enemy, it might have worked. Human shield systems were built on a principle the Brads had never encountered. Most species built shields by projecting energy fields that absorbed or deflected incoming fire. Human ships did something different. The materials of their hulls, developed over 60 years in facilities no one outside Protocol Lazarus had ever seen, were designed to absorb energy and redistribute it across the entire hull surface, converting the force of the impact into heat, which was then dissipated. The effect was that weapons that should have pierced and caused catastrophic damage instead dissipated their energy over a large area and caused only surface heating. It wasn't an ideal defense. Enough sustained fire in one spot would eventually overcome the redistribution system, but it meant that Versian weapons, which should have destroyed a conventional ship with 1 or 2 direct hits, needed 10 or 15 hits in the exact same spot before they posed a serious threat. The Brads realized this very quickly, and they realized something else very quickly. Human ships did not fight the way any species in the galactic consensus fought. All species in the consensus had combat doctrines based on the assumption that command and control meant hierarchy. Officers gave orders down the chain. Subordinates carried out those orders. It was logical. It was organized. But it also meant that if you broke the command structure, if you took out the flagship, killed the admiral, and jammed communication systems, the fleet's combat effectiveness dropped sharply. The human fleet had no single point of failure. Every captain had full operational authority for their ship and the task group assigned to them. And every ship could communicate directly with every other ship. Decisions that in the Versian fleet would have required 6 levels of command approval were made on human ships in seconds, correcting in real time according to what was actually happening in the battle rather than what the plan assumed. The result was a fleet that seemed to flow. When the Brads pushed in one direction, the human formation did not try to hold its ground. It bent, redirected, and struck at the Versian ships from angles that exposed the push. When a human ship sustained serious damage and needed to retreat, 3 other ships seamlessly took its place without any visible order. Fighting them was deeply unsettling. Admiral Akafor moved through the battle with the calmness of a person who had calculated this scenario in simulations more times than she could count. She watched the tactical display, listened to position reports, and gave adjustments when necessary. Her crew on the bridge worked quietly and efficiently. On the bridge of the Hiroshima, there was no drama, only work. 2 hours into the battle, the Brads released their dreadnoughts. These were the largest ships in the Dominion Navy, 6 vessels, each nearly twice the size of any in the human fleet. They had been kept back, placed on the far edge of the system as a reserve. The Versian commanders decided that the human fleet, despite its unexpected appearance and surprising early efficiency, could not withstand the dreadnoughts. Nothing in the eastern part of the galaxy could stand against them. The 6 dreadnoughts moved fast, firing at long range as they approached. Their weapons were so powerful that even with the human hull redistribution systems, several ships in the line of fire sustained serious damage. 2 human vessels were completely disabled. One, struck by several dreadnought blasts in succession in the same section of the hull, broke apart. Akafor watched this on her display. She did not change her expression. She opened a channel to the 3 task groups that had been assigned exactly for this scenario. Execute hammer response. All 3 groups converge now. 350 ships that had been holding positions on the far flanks of the combat formation turned and simultaneously accelerated toward the dreadnoughts from 3 different directions. Each group carried the fleet's most powerful weapon, not the swarm torpedoes, but direct fire systems. High-energy beam weapons that Protocol Lazarus engineers had, based on principles found in alien technologies, then created larger, more powerful versions. The dreadnoughts, designed to fight enemies that attacked them from the front, found themselves between three converging forces. They tried to turn. The turn time for ships of that size was significant. The human task groups did not give them that time. The battle around the dreadnoughts lasted 19 minutes. When it ended, 4 of the 6 were destroyed, and the remaining 2 were drifting without motion, sending out emergency signals. 38 hours after the fleet arrived in the system, every Vertian orbital platform around Brad Prime was destroyed. The naval shipyard on Vereticondis was ruined. The remaining Vertian warships, those that had survived and continued to fight, were retreating toward Brad Minor, having no space left on the surface of Brad Prime. In the Great Canyon city that served as the capital of the Empire, the Versian Emperor sat in a chamber deep underground and watched feeds from his surviving military assets. The reports were all the same. His commanders were not asking for permission to counterattack. They were asking for permission to retreat. Some simply retreated. Never in his 30 years of ruling the Dominion had he experienced such a feeling. He had no name for it. His species did not use this feeling often enough to develop a common word for it. But it was a feeling of complete, helpless insufficiency. Not because of luck, not because of numbers, not because of some temporary advantage that would vanish with changing conditions, but because of a superior force, superior in fundamental parameters that had been built very long, carefully, and purposefully for this exact purpose. He broadcast a ceasefire request on an emergency frequency. On the bridge of the Hiroshima, the communications officer turned to Admiral Akafor and reported that the Vertian Emperor was requesting an immediate ceasefire and opening negotiations. Akafor did not take her eyes off her tactical display. "Log the transmission," she said. "Note the time. Include a note that it was received and considered." The officer paused. "Admiral, are we accepting the ceasefire?" Akafor's eyes moved from the display. "Fleet, continue," she said quietly into the open channel. "Command." The communications officer logged the transmission, noted the time, and included the note. The fleet continued. Across the galaxy, at the consensus station and on dozens of home worlds, alien governments and military commands watched the combat data streaming from their intelligence assets in the Vertian system. The data was transmitted in near real time, and what they saw stopped conversations. Briefings were interrupted, dinner tables were abandoned. Generals, admirals, and politicians stood before screens with expressions ranging from shock to something closer to sincere fear. This was not something humanity was capable of. This was not something anyone had modeled, predicted, or imagined. The Versian Dominion, possessing 300 years of military experience, a massive fleet, a well-fortified home system, and a reputation as one of the most powerful military forces in the known galaxy, was being methodically, precisely, without malice, without chaos, even without visible effort, dismantled. Several alien governments quietly began reviewing their own histories of interaction with humanity. They began reconsidering how they had voted on Earth's applications for consensus membership. They began reconsidering what they had said about humans in diplomatic channels. More than a few of them were, at that moment, very grateful that they had never done anything to directly provoke the species they were watching on these screens. The old delegate Aaron, who had worried in the halls on the day of the attack, sat alone in his private cabin and watched the battle broadcast, resting his long, thin hands on his knees. He was not surprised. He had done his research. He knew, as very old beings with very long memories know things, that such an outcome was possible, that humanity was not what the galaxy assumed it to be. That the silence of the last 11 months was not the silence of defeat, it was the silence of preparation. He watched the Vertian system burn and thought about the transmission Earth had sent on the 3rd day of the bombardment. "We are still here. We remember everything." He now understood, in a way he hadn't fully grasped even then, what that message truly meant. It was not a statement of survival, it was a promise. When the firing finally stopped, the Versian system went quiet in a way it never had before. Not peacefully. Silence is not the same as peace. A room where something terrible has just happened is quiet. A street after an accident is quiet. The Versian system was quiet like these things, with the weight of what had just happened, pressing down on everything, making even the normal sounds of machines, systems, and living creatures small and distant. The orbital platforms were gone. Their debris drifted slowly in wide arcs around Brad Prime, catching the meager light that reached this depth of the system. The naval shipyards on Vereticondis were dark and broken. The ships that had fought a few hours ago now drifted without engines. Their emergency beacons sent weak, steady pulses into the darkness, the interstellar equivalent of a raised hand saying, "We are here. We are no longer a threat. Please do not destroy us." Admiral Akafor's fleet held positions in the space between the planets. They did not advance toward the surfaces of the planets. This was not an accident or a limitation. It was a decision. The target priorities of Operation Consequences had been very clear from the start. Military infrastructure, naval forces, orbital weapon platforms, everything that made the Versian Dominion capable of projecting force against other civilizations. These were the targets. The cities on Brad Prime, the civilian settlements on Brad Minor, the agricultural regions, the schools and hospitals, and the millions of ordinary Versian citizens who did not choose to bomb Earth. These were not the targets. This distinction most confused the galaxy in the days that followed. A species that had lost 2 to 3 billion people had sent a fleet across the galaxy, destroyed the most powerful military force in the Eastern Quadrant, and then stopped. They did not use their advantage on the surfaces. They did not demand unconditional surrender, as historically, conquered species were sometimes forced to crawl. They took nothing. They simply stopped. And then Admiral Akafor opened a broadcast channel to the Versian system and addressed the people of the Dominion. "People of the Versian Dominion," she said. Her voice was level, like the voice of a teacher, not cold, precise, but carrying an authority that did not need to be raised to be felt. "Your government chose to attack our world without warning or provocation. Your government chose to kill 2 to 3 billion people. Your army has been destroyed as a direct consequence of that choice. We did not target your civilian population. We will not target your civilian population. The loss of life on your worlds today, although inevitable in the course of this operation, was not our goal." She paused. "Rebuild. Create a government that does not point weapons at civilizations that have done nothing to them. Create a society in which your children can live without relying on the suffering of others. If you do this, we will never return. If you do not, if a new Versian Dominion emerges that chooses the same path as the one we have just finished, you now know what the consequence of that choice looks like. We are not asking for a response. We have nothing more to say." She closed the channel. The broadcast spread across the Versian system. It reached the deep underground chamber where the Emperor sat surrounded by the few advisors who hadn't yet fled. It was played in shocked silence in hospitals and civilian shelters where Versian families had gathered to wait out the battle. It was received by all surviving military facilities, most of which had already ceased functioning. The Emperor listened to it all. Without moving, when it was over, he sat in silence for a long time. He expected threats. He expected demands. He expected that he would have to humiliatingly bow his empire before these people in a formal ceremony of submission. This was what the Dominion demanded of the species it conquered. It would have been humiliating, but understandable. It was the grammar of power the Dominion understood. This was not that. He was told that the humans had already gotten what they came for and were leaving. He was told that the choice of what the Dominion would become next was his. They gave him, after everything that had happened, a kind of terrible freedom. He did not know what to do with it. At an emergency session of the Galactic Consensus, which was convened 36 hours after the battle ended, the halls were louder than they had been in decades. Delegates from species from all over the consensus were arguing, asking questions, accusing. The Versian delegation was present but silent. They had received instructions from Brad Prime to say nothing and offer nothing until the extent of the situation became clearer. Most of the noise in the hall came from species reacting to the fact that a conflict of this scale had occurred in space adjacent to the consensus and no one had stopped it. But beneath all the noise was a very specific kind of fear, because the battle was not the scariest thing that had happened in the last 24 hours. The scariest thing had happened 4 hours after the battle ended, when the consensus's internal investigation office released a preliminary report based on evidence delivered to the consensus by an anonymous source. The report was short. It listed with specific details and supporting documents the names of 7 consensus member species that had secretly assisted the Versian Dominion in planning the attack on Earth. The assistance took different forms. One species had provided detailed orbital survey data of Earth that the Brads used to plan the bombardment. 2 others had voted at certain points in the political process in the consensus to delay responses and kept humanity's membership application on hold forever, not because of honest political disagreement, but because they had been offered economic concessions by the Versian Dominion in exchange. One had transmitted intelligence on Earth's military potential intelligence that helped the Brads conclude that humanity could not defend itself effectively. 7 species named, documented, exposed. The hall quickly went from loud to very quiet. Everyone in that room understood what the report meant, because everyone in that room understood where it had come from. It did not come from the Brads. It did not come from a neutral investigation. It came from human intelligence networks that were now crystal clear to have been operating inside the consensus itself for years, perhaps decades. How deep did these networks go? How much did humanity know? How many conversations in how many halls had been overheard? How many private diplomatic messages had been intercepted? No one knew the answer to these questions. And the fact that no one knew was, if anything, more frightening than any specific answer. Ambassador Draxus was still at the consensus station when the report was released. He had been trying since the beginning of the battle to maintain a facade of calm. That was becoming increasingly difficult. When the report was made public and his screen filled with the details of the 7 named collaborators, he finally gave up on any attempt to look composed. He sat very quietly in his chair. Around him, delegates of the named species were already using their personal communication systems. Some of them were clearly trying to contact their governments. Some simply sat in a peculiar, frozen silence of people who had just seen everything collapse and had not yet realized what to do next. One of the delegates from a smaller neutral species leaned over to his colleague and said in a very quiet voice that he was beginning to think the humans knew what would happen before it happened. His colleague, a cautious and experienced diplomat who had spent 40 years learning not to say anything that could be used against her, did not reply, but her silence spoke enough. The old delegate Aaron watched all of this from his seat with the same quiet, steady expression he had worn throughout. He looked at the accused delegates. He looked at the nervous species that were not accused, but who were clearly wondering if they should have been. He looked at Ambassador Draxus, whose controlled exterior had finally cracked enough to show fear beneath it. And he thought of something that one of the oldest philosophers of his species had written centuries ago about the nature of power. The philosopher argued that the most complete form of power was not the ability to destroy an enemy. It was the ability to make the enemy doubt that you knew what you were capable of and what you intended to do next. The philosopher called this the power of unknown magnitude. Humanity, the old delegate thought, had just demonstrated this principle in the most thorough way possible. The galaxy did not know the full scale of what the humans knew. It did not know the full scale of what humans were capable of. It did not know what other possibilities existed that had not yet been shown, and it did not know, and this, perhaps, was the most important thing, what humanity intended to do next. That uncertainty was worth more than any number of warships. Back on Earth, news of the battle's outcome reached a population that was still in the deep process of mourning and recovery. Cities were still ruined. Monuments were still being built. In the rubble of places that had been hit hard and then buried under the chaos of everything that followed, bodies were still being found. The reaction to the victory was not a simple celebration. There were people who felt relief, and people who felt a complex mix of grief and something that might have been pride. There were people who had lost everyone they loved and felt nothing, only a kind of numbness that had come months ago and had not yet passed. There were people who thought it had been necessary, and people who thought it had been too much, and people who couldn't decide between those two things and thought about it late at night. But there was one thing almost everyone agreed on. The United Earth Council passed a resolution that authorized perhaps the most significant act of the entire post-attack period. They ordered a continuous broadcast, transmitted on all frequencies in all directions into every corner of the galaxy where human signals could reach. The broadcast was a reading of the names, 2 to 3 billion names. Every person who had died in the bombardment, their names spoken aloud in the languages of the countries and communities they came from, read by volunteers from all over the world who took turns speaking into the microphone for hours. The broadcast went on without interruption. It took 9 days. No political statements, no declarations of victory, no commentary. Just names, spoken carefully and clearly one after another, without end, until every one of them had been said aloud in the universe. At the consensus station, the broadcast was received on the first day and immediately became a subject of conversation in diplomatic circles. Several species found it incomprehensible. Why waste 9 days reading names when the conflict was over? What was the point? It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It achieved nothing practical. But there were others who understood it very precisely. This was a message delivered not with weapons or politics, but with something that most species in the galaxy had forgotten or never learned to recognize. It was a statement of what humanity valued, of what they considered worthy of speaking aloud, of what kind of civilization they intended to be. A civilization that remembered its people not as statistics, not as a number in a report, but as individual personalities with names that deserved to be spoken. It lasted 9 days. The galaxy listened. Not all of it. Not every species sat by their receivers for 9 days. But the transmission was there, steady, continuous, filling the space between the stars with the names of the fallen. And something about that, about the scale of the grief and the patience of the remembering, made a very deep impression on the civilizations that received it. The old delegate Aaron sat in his cabin at the station and listened to it for a long time. He listened until he had to stop, not because he wanted to, but because something in his old chest was pressing too hard, and he needed to walk before he could sit calmly. He had lived a very long time. He had seen species rise and fall. He had seen wars begin and end. He had seen civilizations make terrible mistakes, and sometimes recover from them, and sometimes not. In 400 years, he had never heard anything like this. A year after the Battle of Brad Prime, the galaxy was a different place. Not different in a way that could be directly pointed to. The stars were in the same places. Trade routes ran along the same paths. The galactic consensus still sat in its great halls at the station in neutral space. Delegates from dozens of species still argued about borders, resources, and laws, and about everything that large political entities argue about endlessly. On the surface, much looked the same, but beneath it all, something fundamental had changed. The shift was not easy to express in one sentence, although many diplomats, scientists, and political analysts tried to do exactly that in the months that followed. Whatever they said, regardless of their species or point of view, they always returned to this. Before the Battle of Brad Prime, humanity was a footnote. After it, humanity became a question that every other civilization quietly asked itself. An unknown factor that was factored into every strategic calculation. A name that surfaced in conversations that had nothing to do with humanity, simply because it was now impossible to think about power, conflict, and the structure of the galaxy without thinking about what Earth had done and what Earth might do next. The galactic consensus made its offer 6 weeks after the battle. It was not a small offer. It was the most generous membership offer the consensus had made to any new species in over a century. Full membership with all the rights it entailed. A permanent seat on the Security Council, one of the most influential positions in the consensus structure. Veto power over decisions that directly affected the human solar system. Guaranteed protection under the laws of the consensus. The offer was read in the hall by the consensus Secretary General, a tall being from the Dulhuri species known for his cautious, measured approach to everything, and was met with a particular silence in the hall, full of beings who were not entirely sure how the answer would return. Earth's response came 3 days later. It was delivered by a human diplomat named Marcus Wepp, a quiet, precise man in his 40s, who had spent 20 years working in institutions adjacent to the consensus, and who was apparently one of the intelligence operatives embedded in the consensus years before the attack. He stood in the center of the hall before every delegate from every major species and, without visible emotion, read the response of the United Earth Council. Earth refused. The full response was, of course, longer. It thanked the consensus for the offer. It acknowledged the gesture. It noted in cautious and specific language that the offer should have come 40 years ago when Earth first applied, and that the fact that it came only now, after Earth had demonstrated a military potential that the consensus could not ignore, said everything that needed to be said about the nature of the offer and what it was actually based on. And then it was stated that humanity had decided to go another way. The path was called the Tyrant Sovereign Pact. During the previous year, while the galaxy processed the battle, the investigation reports, and the 9-day transmission, human diplomats had been doing something much quieter. They had been talking to the small species, those who had no seat on the Security Council and no veto power, and no powerful allies. Those who existed in the gaps between the major powers, too small to be important and too present to be ignored. Those who had seen the Vertian Dominion mock, threaten, and take, with no one to turn to for help. There were more of these species than most people in the consensus realized. When you only paid attention to the large and powerful, the small became invisible. The Brads understood this, and used it. These small species were excellent prey because no one would do anything when they were threatened. Humanity had spent a year talking to them. The Tyrant Sovereign Pact was not a military alliance in the traditional sense. It was not built on the consensus model with its endless committees, layers of bureaucracy, and political compromises that took years to resolve. It was simpler. Its core was one promise. Any species that signed the pact and was attacked without provocation would receive a response from the tyrant fleet. Not a diplomatic response, not a stern statement, but a response. 12 species signed on the first day. Another 23 signed within a month. The galactic consensus watched this with mixed reactions. Some were openly hostile. The formation of an independent bloc outside the structures of the consensus was a direct challenge to its authority, and the consensus knew it. Some were quietly concerned for more personal reasons, wondering if the human intelligence networks that had already exposed the 7 collaborators in the Versian attack were still active, still observing, still compiling files. Some were simply calculating the new balance of power and trying to understand where they stood in a galaxy that now included a human-led bloc whose military capabilities had just been demonstrated in the most direct way possible. Several mostly small species that had never been happy within the consensus were genuinely relieved. One species from Monet, the small, blue-furred creatures whose delegate sat next to Ambassador Draxus on the day of the attack, had been subjected to threats from the Versian Dominion for years. They paid a sort of unofficial economic tribute to keep Versian ships away from their space, and never told the consensus about it because they knew the consensus would do nothing. When the pact was announced, the Monet delegate wept in the consensus hall, not quietly. She allowed it openly, not trying to stop it. And several delegates who had known her for decades said they had never seen her do such a thing before. She was the first to sign. Admiral Okafor was called to the United Earth Council in the 3rd month after the battle. The hearing was not a celebration. A conscious effort was made to avoid turning it into one. The council decided from the beginning that treating Okafor as a hero in any formal sense would send an undesirable message that Earth was gloating over what happened, that destruction was something to be proud of, rather than something that had been necessary and terrible and would carry weight for a long time. The hearing lasted 2 days. Council members asked difficult questions about the refusal to accept the Brad ceasefire, about the decision to continue the operation after the surrender offer, about the number of Versian military casualties and whether they were all truly necessary, about the exact boundaries of what Operation Consequences was authorized to do, and whether those boundaries had been respected. Okafor answered every question directly and without defensiveness. She explained every decision from the perspective of the strategic logic that guided them. She did not apologize for what she had done, but she also didn't make it sound easy, clean, or without loss. She spoke about it the way a surgeon speaks about a complex operation with the precise language of a person who had made difficult decisions in a difficult situation and was ready to answer for every one of them. At the end of the 2nd day, the council delivered its decision. She was not punished. She was not celebrated. She was thanked for her service and told that she would remain in a command position in the tyrant fleet. It was determined that Operation Consequences had been carried out within the scope of its authorization and that the decisions made during it, although weighty, had been made with appropriate consideration. But the council also added to the record something that technically did not fall under the definition. One of the senior members, a woman from West Africa named Amara Dio, who had been on the council for over 30 years and was known for saying exactly what she thought, regardless of whether anyone wanted to hear it, added a note that she requested to be included forever in the official record of the hearing. The note stated that what humanity had done on Brad Prime was necessary. It also said that necessity is not the same as good, that the ability to do what the fleet had done is something that should be held carefully with both hands and never treated as a simple thing. Okafor read the note. She pondered it for a long time. Then she nodded once, folded the document, and placed it in the inner pocket of her uniform jacket. She kept it there for the rest of her life. The Versian Dominion, in the year following the battle, was in a state of deep internal crisis. The Emperor survived. His government did not survive in a form resembling what was before. The military commanders who had planned the attack on Earth were gone. Some died in battle, others fled. Others were turned over to the new Versian civil council that formed in the power vacuum left by the collapse of the old structure. There was a period of genuine uncertainty regarding what the Dominion would become, and this uncertainty was uncomfortable, sometimes violent, and did not provide clean answers. But in the ruins of the old institutions, something was growing. A young Versian historian named Ket, who worked in what had been the main academic institution of the Dominion before the battle, began a project that she described to her colleagues as simply an attempt to understand what had happened, not the battle itself. There was no shortage of people documenting that. She wanted to understand the longer history, how the Dominion had reached the point where attacking Earth seemed like a reasonable decision. What had been missed? What had been ignored? What mindset led a civilization to see in another living species only resources? She worked on the project for 3 years. The document she eventually produced was long, thorough, and deeply uncomfortable for many Version readers because it spared no one. It described the gradual normalization of contempt, how generations of Brads were taught to see non-Brad species as inferior, and how that education facilitated the decision that destroyed the Dominion's military power and changed the face of their civilization forever. She wrote about humanity specifically, with special attention. She spent time studying human history, something almost no Version scientist had done before her, and what she found shocked her. Not the violence, though there was plenty of it. She was shocked by the pattern, the way humans fell again and again to terrible lows and then returned. Not because they were physically stronger than other species, not because they were smarter, more advanced, or more virtuous, but because of something in how they were made a deep and stubborn inability to accept that what had happened was the end of the story. At the end of the document, she wrote a passage that was quoted more widely than anything she had ever written. She wrote that the galaxy had always assumed that the most dangerous thing was a species that attacks when threatened. But this assumption, she said, was flawed. The most dangerous thing is a species that waits, remembers, and chooses its moment. A species for whom even a century is not too long to prepare for the right answer. She concluded the document with a simple statement addressed to her people. She wrote that they should be glad that humans targeted only what they targeted, that, based on everything she had studied, if humanity had wanted to do more, they could have. The decision not to do so was exactly that, a choice. And choices made from such a position, she wrote, deserve to be understood as clearly as the capability that made them possible. The galaxy beyond the Brads was also changing. The Tyrant Sovereign Pact, by the end of the first year, numbered 41 member species. Small and previously vulnerable members of the galactic community found in the pact something they had never had before, a reliable answer to the question, what will happen if someone decides to threaten us? The answer was no longer, probably nothing. The answer was now a tyrant diplomatic ship appearing in your system with a quiet, steady presence, the full meaning of which every potential aggressor in the galaxy now understood. The bullying had not stopped completely. The old habits of old empires do not change overnight, but they became significantly rarer. The calculation had changed. The cost of threatening a small species that was part of the pact was now tied to the image of the Brad's home system after the battle. And this image had a remarkable effect on decision-making in the eastern and central parts of the galaxy. Several previously aggressive regional powers that year decided to pursue their territorial ambitions through economic negotiations rather than military pressure. No one announced this publicly. No one said, "We are changing our behavior because we fear humanity," but everyone understood it. And the species that had feared these regional powers for decades also understood it and lived their lives a little differently because of it. In the small, quiet office she kept at the Tyrant Fleet Command facility, now a permanent facility. Not a hidden one, Admiral Akafor read the reports coming in from Pact members. She read them carefully, like everything else. She tracked the political situation in systems on the borders of the Pact. She watched fleet movements and patterns of economic pressure, as well as the long, slow games that powerful civilizations play when they calculate whether it is worth it to expand their borders. She read these patterns very well. And what she read in the year following the battle told her something she didn't say out loud to anyone, but kept in the depths of her mind, where she kept everything that needed to be kept quiet. The galaxy was not, despite everything, a safe place. It would not become so because of what happened at Brad Prime. There would be other threats, other calculations, other moments when someone somewhere would decide that the cost of aggression was worth paying. But she also read something else in these patterns, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. A pause before making decisions, a recalculation of costs that now included a factor that hadn't been in any model a year ago. She was quietly and without ceremony satisfied. The Elm, a small species that lived on 2 worlds in a system near the outer reaches of the known galaxy. They were pre-FTL. They had not yet developed the ability to travel between stars on their own, although they were working on it and were perhaps 30 years away from achieving it. They were gentle, curious creatures, deeply communal, with a complex and beautiful tradition of oral storytelling that had preserved their history for thousands of years. They were also completely incapable of defending themselves against interstellar threats. And a regional power called the Gill Compact had been sending them increasingly aggressive diplomatic messages for the last 2 years, with clear economic and territorial intentions behind the language. The Gill Compact was not a member of the Galactic Consensus. They were not members of the Tyrant Sovereign Pact. They were a medium-sized empire in a part of space located between the Consensus territory and the outer fringes. And they had a long history of pressuring smaller neighbors, forcing them to accept unfavorable agreements. No one had ever pushed back against them. They sent the Elms a final ultimatum in the 12th month after the Battle of Brad Prime. The message stated that the Elms would agree to the economic arrangements proposed by the Compact, or the Compact would begin defensive operations in the Elm system, a phrase everyone, including the Elms, understood as occupation. The Elms did not have an interstellar communication system powerful enough to reach most of the galaxy. But a few weeks before receiving the ultimatum, they managed to send a weak signal toward the nearest system associated with the Pact, describing their situation. The signal was intercepted by a relay station, which forwarded it through the Pact's communication network. It reached the Tyrant Fleet Command Facility 17 days after it was sent. In what happened next, there was no drama, no emergency meetings, no speeches. One Tyrant diplomatic ship, fast, elegant, bearing the insignia of the Tyrant Sovereign Pact, was sent to the Elm system. It arrived 4 days after departure, having used the phase shift drive to cross the distance in a fraction of the time the Gill Compact would have assumed possible. The ship appeared in the Elm system and established a standard communication channel with all parties in the area. The Tyrant ambassador sent a short message. She introduced herself and named her ship. She stated that the Elms had contacted them with a request for Pact representation, and she indicated that the Tyrant Sovereign Pact was ready to act as a diplomatic guarantor of the Elms' right to self-determination. Then she simply waited. The Gill Compact had a patrol ship in the area, a standard military ship assigned to maintain a presence during the ultimatum's duration. Its captain received the Tyrant communication, looked at the hull markings of the ship before him, and spent a long time completely motionless at his command station. He knew these markings. Every military commander in any part of the galaxy knew these markings. His government had sent a detailed briefing to all patrol commanders 8 months ago after the Battle of Brad Prime with a very simple central message: these are the markings of Tyrant ships. Under no circumstances should any encounter with a Tyrant ship be treated as conventional. He looked at the markings for a long time. Then he opened a channel to the Gill Compact Central Command and reported the situation. The response from Central Command took 4 hours. When it arrived, it contained only 2 words: return home. The patrol ship turned and left the Elm system. The ultimatum was not extended. The proposals for economic arrangements were quietly withdrawn from the Compact's diplomatic files. The Gill Compact made no public statements about it. In the Elm system, on the surface of the larger of the 2 planets, word spread among the population that the threat had passed. People who had been afraid for months, who had listened as their government read the Compact's ultimatum and wondered what they could do about it, learned that something had happened in the sky above them, that a ship had come, that someone had stood beside them. And that standing was enough. The Elms did not have a tradition of statues or monuments. Their tradition of remembering consisted of oral stories, told carefully and accurately, passed down from generation to generation, kept in the memories of the people rather than in the stone of buildings. In the weeks that followed, they began telling a new story. It was a story about a ship with strange markings that had come from the far edge of the sky and said, in the language of its presence rather than any spoken word, that the Elms were not alone. That story would be told for a very long time. Far across the galaxy, in the office at the Fleet Command Facility, Admiral Akafor read the report from the diplomatic ship. She read it once, put it down. She looked out the small window facing the lunar surface, at the gray rock and the black sky beyond it, and she remained like that for a moment. Then she added the report to the day's files and moved on to the next. There was always more work. The galaxy had many languages. It had its own laws, its own gods, its own ideas about how the world should be ordered and who should sit at its center. It had civilizations that traded, fought, grew, and died for tens of thousands of years. It was vast, complex, often unjust, and sometimes beautiful. and now it had learned something new. It had learned that the species it had ignored, small, fragile, overly emotional, overly warlike, barely interstellar beings from the third planet of an unremarkable star had been watching, learning, building quietly and patiently in the darkness for a very long time. It had kept records of every rejection, every closed door, every vote against them, every moment when the galaxy looked at them and decided they did not matter. Humanity did not need to be the loudest voice in the room. They tried. They asked politely. They filed applications through the right channels. They made their arguments, accepted the rejections, and returned the next year to try again. They played the game the way the galaxy said the game should be played for decades. The galaxy taught them a different lesson, and humanity, as always, as it always would, learned it. They learned it completely, and they learned it well. And now the entire galaxy lived in the very long, very quiet, very attentive shadow of this entity. It did not make them cruel. It did not make them reckless. It made them exactly what they had always been beneath everything else, a species that remembered, built, survived, and under no circumstances surrendered. The galaxy was silent, and in that silence, it was finally paying attention.